Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. Russian forces are continuing their attempted push through Ukraine for multiple decisions, while Ukrainians, led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, are putting up stiff resistance, according to US officials. On February 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation. Ukraine accused Russia of heavy shelling and missile attacks, many on civilian buildings, that continue in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, as well as other major cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol. Many questions are raised about the development of the situation between the real poles behind this conflict. Our panel of guests will answer some of these questions through a detailed analysis. We have via Skype Dr. Don McLean-Gill, Indo-Pacific geopolitical analyst from Philippines, and Dr. Benjamin Barton, assistant professor at Nottingham University from Malaysia, along with Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui, a university lecturer from Algeria, Galma University, joining us via phone. Thank you all for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let's start with the latest updates on the Russia-Ukraine file. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said there are noticeable signs of a Russian withdrawal from the north of Ukraine, but says more battles are ahead in the east. Of the Red Cross is to make a new attempt to evacuate Ukrainian civilians from the besieged city of Mariupol, after a convoy was forced to turn back on Friday. More than 6,200 people were evacuated from Ukrainian cities on Friday, a senior official says. And the United Nations humanitarian chief will travel to Moscow on Saturday or on Sunday to then Kiev to discuss ceasefire efforts, Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said. The United States says it is providing Ukraine with additional security assistance, as well as supplies to respond to a potential Russian chemical attack. Dozens of Ukrainian cultural sites have been damaged in the war, UNESCO says. Let me start with you, Dr. Benjamin Barton, on the following question. We see that there is a sign of or on Russia's promises to stop its offensive on Ukrainian cities, according to the Ukrainian president. Do you think that sanctions are the main reason behind that, or there is another purpose behind such a move from Russia?
Good afternoon. So I think this retreat on Russia's behalf is maybe in part due to the sanctions, but I think is more the reality that we see on the ground. That is that Russia is not making the progress according to the grand strategy behind its invasion and the plans underpinning them. It's been met with tremendous resistance. It's having internal dissension as well. Russian soldiers not willing to fight, not ready to be exposed to the resistance of Ukrainian soldiers. I think even tactically, the Ukrainians are, they're using everything to their advantage. Their knowledge of the land, of course, and their ability to strike the Russians asymmetrically in a type of guerrilla warfare, if you like, which is working, which seems to be working at least in terms of the resistance. I think there's also a desire on behalf of Vladimir Putin and the Russians to draw back troops, perhaps outside of Kiev and its suburbs, as a show of willingness in terms of the upcoming or the ongoing negotiations with the Ukrainians. And on their side, the Ukrainians, have also been willing to demonstrate a little bit of compromise in terms of, appeasing the Russians, especially with regards to their desire to one day join NATO. So I think on both sides, there's this, there's a desire to want to avoid the situation spiraling too far, maybe drawing back a little bit. Whether that will be permanent or temporary, time will only tell. But I think this is more to do with a strategy of the Russians facing the Ukrainian resistance on the one hand, and on the other hand, an expression of willing to sit down with the Ukrainians and show them that they perhaps are willing to now use dialogue as a means to get out of this conflict.
Now, let me move on to you, Dr. Don McLean Jill. Following Lavrov's visit to India and New Delhi's withdrawal in UN votes condemning the Russian invasion, do you think that Russia will persuade India to hold on to its neutral line on the Ukraine war and bypass international sanctions to buy more of its crude oil through a rupee ruble payment after the increasing pressure put on India from Western nations to revise its studied neutrality?
Thank you so much for the question. And before getting into the meat of the discussion, we have to understand that India's strategic autonomy does not translate to mere fence-sitting or mere neutrality, as many observers may tend to understand. In fact, it demonstrates proactivity on contributing to peace, maintaining national interests, ensuring stability of its geopolitical periphery, and of course, its people. We have to understand that India seeks to work within the current system of the rules-based order, for that matter, to acknowledge the position of the United States and to contribute towards the system's stability as a responsible, democratic, major Indo-Pacific power. However, we have to understand one particular point as to why these situations are interpreted this way as far as India is concerned. We have to understand, geographically speaking, India is situated in arguably the most complex neighborhood, sandwiched between two nuclear-armed strategic rivals that seek to nibble on India's territory. And of course, while facing a plethora of other threats, such as terrorism, for that matter. Now, in this context, India needs to maintain a significant military capacity to offset such threats. And Russia, for this matter, many would argue that why is India not distangling from Russia? It has been, in fact, increasing its imports of weapons from the United States, but Russia is seen to provide most sensitive, necessary weapon systems to India based on its current challenges, whereas the U.S. continues to be wary of giving its latest and most sensitive military technology. And as far as the rupee ruble payment for oil, for that matter, we have to understand the issue of territorial integrity and at the same time financial sovereignty. So we have territorial sovereignty, which Russia clearly breaches in Ukraine, but we also have the issue of financial sovereignty, which India is well aware of based on the rules-based order. And in fact, it feels that it compromising its energy security interests at the expense of its people within its borders is something that is not clearly moral for that particular matter. India has cut off Iranian oil, for that matter, as soon as the U.S. made it a certain point to do so. It has, in fact, compromised on a number of issues towards its national interest to accommodate U.S. interests as well. But of course, given the COVID-19 pandemic, the development gap, these are crucial attributes towards the national interest. India maintains its position. It has called Lavrov, for that matter, Prime Minister Modi, to stop the violence in Ukraine. It has emphasized on the national territorial integrity, international law towards Ukraine's position. But it also has a current responsibility towards its people, its own security. Considering that it sees that the U.S., for that matter, has not been as effective in sanctioning China, which is nibbling on India's sovereign territorial integrity and its sovereign rights. So it feels that it has to take certain measures to maximize its own security concerns, since there are certain factors that are not going up to play. But nonetheless, it will want to maintain its position as a stabilizing force in the situation for peace.
Thank you very much indeed. What about you, Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui? Do you think that Martin Griffin's visit, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, to Kiev and Moscow to discuss the ceasefire will have a positive result, especially after the continuous refusal of Russia of any visit by UN officials to discuss its war in Ukraine, including in the weeks before the February 24th?
Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitations. Indeed, we witnessed in the last few days the intensification of UN and US efforts to convince many parts in the world to put more pressure on Russia to end the war and to reach a peaceful settlement as soon as possible. But it seems also that at the battleground, where there is some retreat around Kiev, there is also escalation and shelling going on other fronts in Ukraine. And I think that this escalation is linked in a way to the ongoing negotiation. How is that? Now that there is a platform for negotiations which is established in Istanbul with the new Ukrainian proposal for peace settlement. Now every side of the conflict is trying to get some gains on the battleground, because at the end, the situation in the battleground determines the outcomes of the upcoming negotiation to a large extent. What is unique about the war in Ukraine is that it's not an ordinary war between two nations or two belligerents, but it can be depicted as a smaller picture of a global war between the big powers over the existing world order, whose implications are far-reaching. We saw also the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken visiting Algeria to try to also to pressure Algeria and to convince it to re-evaluate its ties with Russia, as Blinken said. I think since we have now
actually
a platform
Blinken say
for
that? I mean,
negotiations-
just recently there was a press release that was denying all these and said it was just rumors. I mean, the United States would not actually intervene in Algeria's internal affairs or external affairs with other countries.
Okay. It seems that this is not the case. I mean, I can quote Blinken, if you allow me, in one of his statements after his visit to Algeria, saying that, I quote, the Ukraine conflict should cause all countries to re-evaluate relations with Russia. He said, there are times when one issue emerges that is so clearly black and white. It is important, he said, to stand with the victim, and to stand with the principles that have also been violated. This is clearly a stance as if the America is saying, if you are not with us, you are against us. And it seems that this is impractical for two main reasons. First of all, this stance clearly manifests the U.S. double standards in its foreign policy. He is asking Algeria to stand with the victim, but the Americans for example, has never stood with the victim in Palestine. Instead, America has always been supporting unconditionally the aggressor. So I think here America is not a good example for Algeria to follow in this regard. And the second reason I think the American stance is not practical is that Algeria's stance on the Ukrainian crisis is very clear and very balanced. Algerian officials have confirmed many times that they support efforts to achieve a prompt, peaceful settlement of the conflict, and it is an unwavering principle of Algerian diplomacy, and both enemies and allies of Algeria know about this. So, as regards, for example, the demand of America that Algeria needs to boost oil and gas production to ease the tension, to ease the crisis in Europe, Algeria is a sovereign state, and it retains its right as a sovereign state to choose for itself whatever is favorable to its strategic interests. Once again, Algeria is not part of the conflict and cannot be part of conflict. And this same rule applies to many other countries in the world who do not want to be implicated in a way or another in this conflict. So they have the right to keep neutral despite the continuing pressures from the West and from the United States of America in particular.
Thank you indeed. Now let's move on to this piece of info. In a video speech, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the situation in the east of the country remains extremely difficult and that the Russian military is rushing towards the Donbass in the direction of Kharkiv.
The occupiers are withdrawing from the north of our country. It's slow but noticeable. In some places they are being forced out. In other places they are leaving their positions. They are leaving behind them a complete disaster and a lot of danger. It's true, the bombardment can continue. They are mining all this territory. In the east of our country, the situation remains extremely difficult. The Russian military is rushing into the Donbass in the direction of Kharkiv. They are preparing for new powerful blows. We are preparing for an even more active defense. We are using all opportunities, internal and external.
Benjamin Barton, how do you read the escalating situation? Now we see, as you mentioned earlier, that Russian forces are retrieving toward the Donbass region. But is it retrieval or is it a regroupment?
That's a fair question. I think, indeed, there's an element of both. Maybe there's a change of tactics in terms of no longer going through the north, moving to the east. That could also be linked to the negotiations between the Ukraine and Russia in terms of Russian demands, which seem to be territorially linked to Donbass and Lugansk, and those entities which may either be seeking some form of independence or perhaps might be attached somehow to the Russian Federation. It could also be due to the fact that the attempt to encircle Kiev from the north has not worked, and therefore the aim is to go through the east and up through the south and perhaps connect from there to try again to move on Kiev. But I mean, although there's obviously a long way between Kiev and the eastern border with Russia. So it could be about that. There is also the third possibility that this could be an attempt to eventually look towards some kind of compromise to put an end to the fighting in the short term. A message sent out to the Ukrainians and to the rest of the international community.
Is a compromise even likely? Do you see a compromise anytime soon?
I think over time we will see a compromise, simply because, as you mentioned in your initial question, with the sanction regime coming down on the Russian economy, they've lost something like 15 years worth of economic growth. The impact that's going to have on the ability to fund this war, the fact that the morale amongst Russian troops is not the highest, the levels of resistance. I think over time the Russians are going to have to sit down. They're being prompted also by others in the international community, such as the Turks, to come and find a deal. I'm not saying it's going to necessarily end the fighting, but if there is an exit plan for Putin, and he's going to need one at some point, he's going to have to show some
Benjamin Barton, say there is a compromise. Say Ukraine accepted the neutrality. Doesn't this give Russia a veto power over who can and cannot join NATO?
Well, I guess that really is going to depend on what the terms of this compromise might be. But the Ukrainians have already said that as part of their compromise, they're willing to not entertain the idea of joining NATO, although they will continue to entertain the prospect of joining the European Union. So in a way, although I think officially they might say that to appease the Russians, and perhaps Putin can say that, from his end, this is a victory, that he's achieved at least something from this war, that's not solved the issue at hand, because Ukraine still has this desire to gravitate towards the West. And if it's not NATO, then it's the EU. I'm not saying those are the two same organizations, but that there's the same desire there on behalf of Kiev. And that's obviously supported by, I suppose, a large majority of Ukrainians. So the problem is still the same for the Russians. So no, I don't think that gives them the right of veto. And to be honest, if you go all the way back to the end of the Cold War, Russia lost that right a long, long time ago. And I think this is also something that, Putin has tried to live with, but has struggled to do so. And that's also, eventually generated this war.
What about you, Don McLean, Jill? What is your comment in this? And do you have anything to say regarding Russia's position right now in the world? Is it losing its favored position? That's why, let's say, Putin is trying to give it its glorious past.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, let me address the last question first. We have to be realistic on Russia's capabilities, really. I don't think that it would be a pragmatic understanding to label Russia as wanting to reclaim at least the glory of the former Soviet Union in terms of territorial expansion, because as we can see, it is already hampered significantly by its throughout its invasion in Ukraine, and this has caused, of course, through a recalibration of military objectives. Now, if you talk about the peace talks, which was their first question, we have to understand that there were peace talks online yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, or Friday. And before that, in fact, the peace talks before that was seen to be most promising. We can see that Ukraine now is what it seems like to be willing to abandon its NATO membership bid. However, we have to understand that Ukraine also seeks to have a binding security guarantee from a group of countries, such as members from NATO, China, Turkey, etc. Now, this can be seen as a one-way collective defense arrangement. Now, what does that mean? It means that Ukraine would want them to have that responsibility towards Ukraine, but on the other hand, Ukraine will not be having the same military responsibilities, such as, of course, Article 5 in NATO. Now, the question here is not whether Russia would accept that. That is also a question. But the bigger question is whether countries in the West would be willing to give that binding guarantee that Ukraine is willing to put on the table. So this further complicates the situation. Of course, we have to look at that. And of course, the 15-year period of consultation towards Crimea is also put on the table by Ukraine. And in fact, though both sides are now on a similar path towards emphasizing the concept of discussion and talks, we can see that there's still a significant gap in terms of addressing major concerns. However, the direction is on to a good start. Especially since the last talks have been pushed through. We can see that there are more practical conversations between both sides to address
Don McLean, Jill, do you trust Russia's words? I mean, before this special military operation, they were saying it was just a military exercise, just a build-up by the border for a military drill, and then we noticed this invasion. Do you trust Russia's words?
It's absolutely hard to trust words at this particular point in time. In fact, when Russia even gave the guarantees, the West has been quite reluctant to trust on the withdrawal. In fact, after the meeting, there were also shellings from Russian side. So this also is an issue. However, if we look into the sanctions being the only way, we can see that the sanctions are also resulting opposite results for that matter. Domestically, a 20% growth in Putin's approval ratings. The ruble is getting stronger for that matter with support of China's interest to also have its own sovereign digital currency. We have to look into all the alternative options to maintain peace in Ukraine at the expense of the thousands lives lost and the millions being displaced. From now, it's really hard to say which position would be best, but it's good to keep all alternatives open. So we have the sanctions going on, but we also have to really bank on the talks, as this would also be a significant factor. So we have to keep the options open, as hard as it is to trust words at this point in time.
What about you, Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui? How do you see an end out of this? How do you see a resolution to this crisis? Is it going to be anytime soon? The previous guest showed some optimism regarding peace talks. What about you?
Well, I do agree with the previous speakers on that. The trajectory of the upcoming negotiations to reach a peaceful settlement are very complicated, especially that now the obstacles after the major compromise given by Ukrainians, which is to give up their bid to join NATO, the obstacles now I think principally lie in some disputed files, especially those files related to the status of Crimea and Donbass. There is the fear in Ukraine and Ukraine's Western allies that Russia may retreat from Kiev and concentrate its military operation in the east of the country, and this will, increase the prospect of a split, the scenario of split in Ukraine into two parts. That's why they are not, the West and Ukraine are not fully, they are not fully confident of the real intentions of Russia. There are also issues related to the details of the security plan or the security system proposed by Ukraine after it accepts neutrality, which is related to the guarantors. As we know, Ukraine accepted to give up its bid to join NATO in exchange for a security system whereby the security of Ukraine is going to be guaranteed by some countries in the world. It means that Ukraine should also negotiate. We need to know whether these countries will accept to be guarantors, and it's also important to know the exact detailed terms of these guarantees that Ukrainians are demanding. For example, Ukrainian officials said that some countries have already accepted the proposal, and they are negotiating with other countries. And these other countries proposed as guarantors can even attend in the upcoming rounds of talk. They are talking about Canada, France, Turkey, the United States, and Israel, among other countries that can volunteer.
Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui, to follow what's happening on the ground, let's follow this report together and then we get back for final questions.
On Saturday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the military situation in the country's east remained very challenging, adding that Russia was preparing further assaults in Donbas region and Kharkiv.
In the east of our country, the situation remains extremely difficult. The Russian military is rushing into the Donbass in the direction of Kharkiv. They are preparing for new powerful blows. We're preparing for an even more active defense. We're using all opportunities, external and internal.
In a video address, he said also that Russian troops in the north of the country were pulling back, slowly but noticeably. In another statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the European Parliament President Roberta Metsola during a meeting in Kiev for being the first leader of a European institution to visit the Ukrainian capital since the start of the Russian military operation.
I want to thank you personally. Thank you, Roberta, and your team for your visit at such an important time for our country. Ukrainians believe in actions and concrete things. You're showing heroism. Today, it is heroism to come to Ukraine.
This visit comes as the European Union is working on further sanctions on Russia, but any additional measures will not affect the energy sector.
I get back to you, Benjamin Barton. The Kremlin has put blame on Kiev for bombarding a fuel depot in the Russian city of Belgorod on Friday. However, Ukrainian top security officials also denied the accusations. Kremlin said this incident could impact peace talks. In addition to the report that we just followed, how can you be so optimistic?
About the end of this conflict?
Yes.
You mean? I guess optimistic is perhaps not the right word. I was just, referring more to the prospect that at some point the Russians are going to have to find an exit from this crisis, from the war which they started. So how are they going to do that? How is Putin going to be able to set up a situation where he can exit this war and face the Russian people and tell them that he's come out of this war with a victory of some kind? That's going to be the difficulty. So this is why they're looking at all angles. They're continuing with the fighting and the bombardment in the hope that they can neutralize the Ukrainian resistance, that they can get the Ukrainians to stop simply because they're cutting off, their lively provisions, they're damaging the economy, and that Ukrainians over time may grow weary of conflict. They're continuing with the talks because in the talks they want to get Ukrainians to give up on one element or the other. It could be part of their sovereign territory to the Russians. It could be the promises of no longer joining NATO, perhaps even better, no longer wanting to join the EU. And then there's also the situation about how the sanctions are impacting Russia and the relationship with the Russian people, although Putin has, obviously instrumentalized the war to say to the Russian people that, look, the West has always had it in for us, and we can never, I told you that we could never trust them. Now you have the proof. How long is that message going to hold? How long are Russian people who are themselves the ones who are suffering, particularly those working outside of the public sectors in Russia, going to want to continue living this life where, things are going to become prohibitively expensive, their purchasing power is going to go down, their savings have been lost, and they're finding
indeed.
themselves
Point
gradually
clear, Benjamin
isolated
Barton.
from the...
Thank you so much. We ran out of time. I would have loved to give you more time and also to hear the opinion of the other guests. It's the time for our show to end. Thank you so much for tuning in to our channel, and bye for now. Goodbye.